Hello, friends. This is Carter, and welcome to this episode of Making It Up, the show where I talk to writers of all different backgrounds and pick their brains. We have a great conversation, talk about writing, publishing, creativity, struggles, turmoil, all the good stuff. And true to form, when I say writers of all backgrounds, today's episode features a science writer. So this is the first time I haven't really had a fiction writer on. Today, I have Erika Engelhaupt, who's a freelance science writer and editor. So as Erika describes in the podcast, she has an interest and perhaps a fascination with gross, icky, weird stuff. And that kind of led her to start writing about gross things and icky things and gory things for National Geographic. And she actually now has a book out based on the blog that she used to write. It's called Gory Details, Adventures from the Dark Side of Science. So it was really interesting to talk to her, figure out kind of what makes her tick, talk about somebody who has a very specific interest and wants to show the world, how all of these, what we perceive to be gross, icky things it's just science and it's just nature and there's nothing to be horrified about. So she kind of breaks it all down with humor, with facts. So she was very interesting to talk to. And she's also a great storyteller. She's has a history with that. It's not all just nonfiction stuff. And at the end of our conversation, we make up a story based on a sentence from the book North and South by John Jakes. So here's your first nonfiction writer on Making It Up. Hope you enjoy. This is my conversation with Erika Engelhaupt.
There we go. How are you?
I'm well. How are you? What a pleasure to meet you.
Good. You too. I've been looking forward to this one. It seems like I love what you're doing, and it just seems like it's going to be a lot of fun.
Well, I appreciate it. Yeah, we have fun here. I like the wood. There's a very 1950s kind of feel going on behind you.
Yes,
it's kind of got a Mad Men little bit of a thing going on.
That's pretty much my whole house. I live in a mid-century modern house in Knoxville, Tennessee. It was built by a local architect here who, did mid-century modern design back in the day. And
how cool.
Yeah. So, and my husband and I already had all kinds of vintage furniture from DC. And so when we saw this house, it was like, finally, we have the house that goes with all of our furniture. So
Mad Men is a series that I go back to probably once every 2 to 3 years, and mostly for the set design. It's I don't know. There's something about it, but yeah, it's wonderful. What brought you to Knoxville?
Originally my husband's job, he was working at Oak Ridge National Lab. But we just love it here. He doesn't even work at the lab anymore, and I'm freelance. So we both work for ourselves now. And we just decided that we liked it here so much that we, decided to stay.
Awesome. Yeah, I've spent a decent amount of time in Tennessee. It's a beautiful place for sure. So where did you grow up?
All over. I was born in Kansas City, Missouri, okay, and lived there till I was about 7. And then I lived in Orlando, Florida area. And then we tended to make these big jumps from really hot to really cold places. So we went from there to the Buffalo area near Niagara Falls on a little island called Grand Island, New York.
Sure. Yeah.
That is kind of in the Niagara River. And so we moved there in December, of course, when I was in 8th grade, and lived there for a while. And then I lived briefly in Huntsville, Alabama, when my dad got a job there, and my parents still live in Huntsville. But then since then I've lived, all over. I lived 10 years in New Orleans, 10 years in DC, and 3 years in Boulder. You're close to Boulder, right?
Yeah, I'm in Boulder County. So I'm about 10 miles away from downtown Boulder.
Yeah.
So, yeah, because you went to CU, right? For a master's.
I did. Yeah. For a master's degree. Yeah.
Did you love it?
Yeah. I did love it. I loved CU. That's where I basically became a science writer.
Okay.
I was just a science nerd before that. I had been, I started off in a PhD program at CU Boulder and in biology, and I ended up deciding that I just didn't really want to finish a whole PhD. I really wanted to go straight into science writing and science journalism.
Let's back up a little bit, because you're actually the first nonfiction writer that I've had on. And you've got a pretty interesting background. So I have a lot of questions for you. But so you said you were a science geek. Like, how did that manifest itself as a child, or was that in fact something as a child? And did that relate to what your parents did or anything like that?
Well, kind of, yeah. My dad's an engineer and inventor. And so one of the reasons we moved around so much was because he would get different jobs as an engineer. He was kind of working his way up, and he kind of, started out from the bottom and worked his way up. He was always, so there was always like sciencey stuff going on in my house. We had probably the only lab that wasn't a meth lab in our house. In Florida, my dad actually built he built his own lab building, and it was like kind of, so we lived in a mobile home at that point. And so it was like, we had our mobile home, and then we had this like concrete block building that he built next to it that was like half kind of living room and half laboratory space. And so it was, so that's a little bit weird. I think I've got a picture that I keep on my desk from, you can see it. This is me and my dad circa like 1982.
Yeah.
In
that
our
looks like a big
home lab space. So there's like a sofa weirdly on the other side of the lab bench.
Yeah. Right.
So,
well, that's pretty cool. Now, was there an invention that people would know him for, or did he just, what kind of things?
Only if you happen to be in the field of like electrochemistry and electroplating stuff.
Oh, like I am. So I probably know him.
He has a whole bunch of patents for things. He worked at different engineering companies and developed a lot of things in the electrochemistry world. And
so you had that mix of reading, and it's interesting when you're being exposed to science in the way that your dad was practicing it in terms of inventing. You're really being exposed to just curiosity, right? Like, just exactly. how does this work? And there is such a parallel between that and writing in certain senses of like, the discovery. So it sounds like you picked up at least like, maybe not his field, but his curiosity.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that served me pretty well because, especially the kind of stuff I write, it's really all about curiosity. And, it's, a lot of people think that I probably write for kids when I say that I write about gross science stuff. And so I guess in a sense, I'm like a kid who never grew up. I never lost the interest.
So this is kind of what's interesting to me is that you went to school and the idea was that you were going to do this PhD but you had this pull towards, journalism and writing, and you even got a degree in journalism. So where did the writing aspect, because there's I feel like those are two different kind of brain parts they can, because a lot of people study sciences struggle with writing and vice versa for sure. Where did that passion for wanting to actually write come from?
I think that because I was such a big reader, my mom taught me how to read before I went to kindergarten. And and I always read, and I always, I wouldn't say I necessarily like wrote a lot as a kid, probably because of my own hangups about wanting it to be, everything I wrote to be right and correct. I had like that science-y kind of thing. Like there was a right answer and a right way of doing things and a wrong way of doing things. And I was always afraid I was doing it wrong. But I loved reading and kind of secretly dreamed of being a writer. And I didn't know if I was creative enough to do that. Because I think, you know, as a kid, and maybe especially as a girl, when you are good at science and math and that kind of stuff, teachers and parents and people tend to encourage you in that direction. And so at least now they do, you know, because, you know, we're all trying to, you know, encourage our girls to go into science fields and so forth, which is great. You know, it's no problem at all. But I felt much more encouraged towards those things that I was good at, rather than my, you know, language and writing skills.
Humanities, yeah.
Yeah. And so, you know, I mean, I just had no idea what you would do if you were an English major in college or something like that, which now I have a totally different view of. Like, I kind of wish that I had an English degree or something.
I think
instead.
that still holds true. I think a lot of English majors struggle with that too. I mean, I certainly didn't go to school for writing, and, you know, I never took any creative writing classes or anything like that. But yeah, but you were thinking that maybe you're not creative enough, to get into fiction. So, I mean, nonfiction is so much harder.
Well, I mean,
you have to be right.
This is up for debate, right? I mean, is it?
Oh my goodness. I couldn't even imagine. That's why it's so interesting to me, because because you have to, first of all, you have to be a good, compelling writer for doing what you're doing, right? You're not writing for the science community, you're writing for the public. And so you have to have those skill sets, which I think are incredibly hard to get down, how to be, you know, pithy and to the point and funny but also accurate and meaningful. And
it's
then you have all, and then you have all the research.
It's a lot.
I don't research at all, mostly because I'm lazy, and it just feels like a lot of work. And I can't imagine where that's kind of all you do. Do you have something that you prefer, or do you like the writing more than you like the research, or?
So in journalism, you know, we tend to say, like, some people are naturally more reporters and some people are writers. And we, you know, that breakdown is kind of like the people who really love doing the reporting, you know, getting out there, they love interviewing people, they love the research and digging up all the facts, and, you know, we'll go down rabbit holes and all of that. And I definitely have that side, where I love that part, and I love a rabbit hole. I mean, absolutely. But I would say I'm more of a writer. I really enjoy it once I have what I want to say, and then I get to think about how I want to say it.
Yeah.
For me, that's the fun part of it. And that's where you can be creative and be a little different, because otherwise you're hemmed in by the same facts that everybody else is, right? Like, as a science journalist, when you're covering news in science, you know, like, latest study says this, all of the other science journalists all have access to more or less the same facts that you do. Right. You know what I mean? And so what's going to set your story apart from anyone else's, you know, I think it's largely, it's the writing, it's how you tell it. And, you know, the little world that you create within that piece. You're hemmed in by the facts. And there are times when I really want to write fiction and think, God, how nice would it be to not be bound by the facts, by the truth, you know, if I could just make this stuff up, it'd be a lot easier.
Yeah. Well, it's so interesting because so you're right. Like, when you're writing fiction, you're not bound, but you are to a certain degree, depending on what you're writing, right? If you're writing science fiction, or even, you know, thrillers, which I write, you know, I shouldn't say I don't ever do any research. I do some research, and I want to make sure, okay, if this person has this kind of psychological ailment. It's just not an ailment I
Right.
made up. It's got to be rooted in something, but can
Right.
you have some latitude with it? Sure. But you always want to bounce it off people who kind of know. But there are other thriller writers who will make sure nothing varies at all. So even like the stingiest of scientists would say, okay, and that's
Yeah.
because they love to do that. But you have such a background now. I mean, obviously, if you were going to write fiction within the realm of what you write nonfiction, it would be a second nature in terms of the science and the facts, right?
Yeah.
You
yeah,
wouldn't
the
have to
research
be
and
like, yeah. So
yeah, and I've thought about that a little bit. Like, I've thought of ideas for very vague ideas for works of fiction that I could write. But it's hard when you are a science writer and you're used to being bound in by the facts, because if I'm going to write something where somebody is time traveling, or there's, an apocalypse, like a pandemic or something, then I want it to be realistic at the same time, but the only problem being that if it's something like time travel, that's not actually a real thing. So,
right.
So how do you make it feel real and feel like plausible science? I really love sci-fi writers who pull that off, who make the science feel plausible so that you get totally immersed. That suspension of disbelief is there, which for me is pretty easy. I can fall into fiction that way. But a lot of readers, especially if they know anything about science, will be very distracted, by nitpicky things. Like when you're getting the science wrong, then it becomes very distracting.
Yeah.
When you're saying something that's actually like, not how gravity works or something like that,
Right. And it doesn't have to be science, right? It could be anything where if you're writing a character who acts in a way, you present this character in a way, and then all of a sudden they act against their character.
Right.
And the reader doesn't believe that they would do that pulls them out. And now all of a sudden you no longer care about the character. If you have facts wrong, if you have science wrong, that's the same thing. Well, why should I care about the characters if this whole setting is just, a gimmick?
Right.
But you're never going to reach everybody, right? My goal is I can get 2/3 of the readers to buy into these facts, and you're always going to get reviews that say like, "Oh, this part was unbelievable." But if that's only 1/3 of the people, then I think you're doing
right. Then you figure you're doing well. Yeah. And it is hard because I'm trying to get everyone to like believe in my facts. I'm writing nonfiction stuff and trying to have it all right all the time, and. Especially because science is not, there's really not always a right answer and a wrong answer. There's so much in science that's changing that scientists don't even agree on necessarily, that that I have to be very careful in saying what's speculation, what's a scientist's opinion versus something that has been tested that we feel like is true. There's a lot of gray area, I guess, even with science, in terms of what is true, what is right. That's the thing that science writers, lie awake at night worrying about is, did they get something wrong, or did they make some really like just stupid mistake? I mean, I think of, I did a fellowship at the Philadelphia Inquirer, the newspaper, and there was a writer there who told me a story about one time she wrote a story for the paper, and it was something about like weather balloons or something, and she had just a little mention in there of the weather balloons were this many miles up, but it was supposed to be that many feet up in the air or something like that.
That's a big difference.
And so it was something like that, where it was just like a silly, obvious mistake.
Right.
Like she obviously just like wrote down the wrong word. But she said she got so many calls when that came out in the paper of people just like yelling at her and telling her she was stupid and shouldn't be allowed to write for the newspaper, and what kind of a moron, and I'm sure a lot of it was probably pretty sexist too, because she was a woman, but Yeah. And so she
That's
said
horrible.
she had to go home crying that day. Like
Oh my
it was
goodness.
it was so bad. And so we like science journalists like live in fear of that moment when when you've made some like stupid mistake
Yeah.
and everyone just like piles on. And so the blog originally came about when I was working at Science News magazine, and which is based in DC. And so there was an opportunity, basically they decided we're going to start some blogs, and I really wanted to be doing more writing. I was doing a lot of editing, and I remember I had this moment where I looked at the bookshelf in my office, where I had all of the books that I had like read, and science books that I had read and reviewed and things like that. And they all, well, I still have some of them behind me, probably. They all had names like The Killer of Little Shepherds and Blood Work. And, it was all this like, everything was something gross or morbid.
Right. These are great fiction titles, by the way. I'm writing some of these down.
Yeah. Yeah. And all of a sudden it really was one of those things where it kind of came to me almost as a full, complete idea of what I wanted to do as a blog, and even the name. All of a sudden, I was like, I know what I want to do. I want to write about the kind of weird and morbid science that I'm interested in, and it's going to be called Gory Details, and I want it to address the things that people are afraid to talk about, and the science behind them. And so first I pitched it as a blog, as a column idea, to my boss, and got a big like total lack of interest in having,
they didn't want to talk about
this as a column. And but I just kind of sat on it for a while. I was like, I think this is a good idea. And so then when they decided to do blogs in addition to columns, which really, what's the difference other than like one goes in the print magazine and the other one's online, but whatever. So when they decided to do blogs, then I brought it back up and I was like, no, I still really want to do this thing. And so they let me do it. And I wrote about a bunch of weird stuff, and people really liked it.
Yeah.
And it was definitely different for Science News than the more like serious topics in science, I guess, that a lot of people were covering there. And so I kind of got the reputation for being, like the pee and poop beat reporter.
You were the spooky Fox Mulder of the...
Yeah, right. Like all the gross stuff, like people were sending me emails, any paper that came out that involved urine or whatever. And but that was okay with me. I enjoyed it, and I still approach Gory Details with the same concept I started off with, which is it's not really just about pointing out things that are gross or scary. It's about learning something fascinating about nature and how the world works, and our place in the universe. And so there always has to be some fascinating science bit in there to me. It can't just be purely gross. And
right.
Yeah.
That
and
also softens the whole thing, right? Like the more you learn about it, the less it comes off as gross anymore.
Yeah, exactly. And I think my grossometer has definitit shifted over time with the stuff I write about.
You've got a Teflon shield.
But also I think it has made me less afraid of things, like writing about, death and disease and parasites, like just writing about kind of awful things that could happen to you. For me, it has made me less afraid of those things. I feel like, like when I went and saw autopsies, for the first time in real life in Baltimore, I was pretty nervous about it. I don't know if I had ever seen a dead body in real life. I think I'd been to one funeral maybe that had an open casket. But that's obviously a very, a very particular way of seeing a dead body. And so I was nervous about it. But I, it's one of those things, like once you've done it, then you can understand how, people can get through med school and like see this stuff all the time.
Right. Well, some people can't get through med school for that same reason. Like,
right. Exactly.
The Constitution for it.
Yeah. But I guess I figured out that I have the Constitution for it. I think if I had gone to med school, which was a possibility when I was in college, I kind of have always thought that maybe I would have ended up becoming a pathologist or a medical examiner or something like that. I just feel like, I think I maybe had that in me.
Yeah.
And I think I would have enjoyed that actually more than dealing with patients.
You're a people person, just in a very particular way.
Yeah, right.
I mean, and then this collection of blogs over the years, I assume, formed the basis for Gory Details, the book that just came out. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I took the blog with me when I went from Science News to National Geographic and started working there as the online science editor. And so I kept doing it while I was working at Nat Geo. And then when we decided to turn it into a book, it was great. I mean, I really wanted to do this because I really wanted to be able to expand on what I had done for the blog. And there were so many other things that as a full-time editor, I just didn't have time to do, or, the freedom to go do, if, as far as travel and stuff. So it was great when we decided to do it as a book. And so I of course made the mistake of thinking, well, I've got the book like half written already. This is going to be really easy, right? Because I've already got blog posts to start with.
Right.
And it does not turn out to work that way. It still feels like I wrote a whole book because, I had blog posts, but I wanted to update them, expand them, add more things to them. And then I also wanted to write a lot of,
since you wrote
I mean, things can change. And there were things I wanted to update and then things I just wanted to add to because I had written them for online and they were kind of short and there was more I wanted to say that I just couldn't do originally. And so there was that. And then plus I wanted to write new stuff too. So it ended up being, I would say, of the actual words in the book, it's certainly more than half that's new. And it felt like it, it was a lot of, a lot of coming up with what are the topics and themes that I want to bring out, because we kind of grouped the book into 6 sections. It is a collection of short stories, but I didn't want it to feel random throughout.
Right.
And so we came up with these themes like morbid curiosity and disgust, and taboos, things that were kind of running threads through the stuff that I had done. And then I would be like, okay, well, I've got these pieces that fit into the category of morbid curiosity. What else do I want to say about morbid curiosity? What other things do I want to explore for that? And so then that was so much fun because I got to just like come up with ideas of like the things that I had been wanting to write about, and go do them.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of how the book evolved out of a blog, because otherwise I feel like, a lot of people have done books that started as blogs. And the hard part is not having it feel like a random assortment of blog posts. I mean,
right.
People don't really want to sit down and like read your blog for, 8 hours straight.
Right. Right. But on the other hand, you still have to, because I assume when you're looking at this idea as a venture, your baseline audience is going to be the people who are familiar with your blog. So it can't stray too far away from that, where you want them to feel like, oh yeah, this is why I bought this book, because I love how she writes and I love how they're structured. So it's got to be a balancing act, right? I assume.
Exactly. Of like more of the same, but all with some little, narrative threads tying things together.
Right.
But not like doing something totally different from what you were doing on the blog.
Yeah.
So
that makes sense. How did that feel when you first got the copies of the book? Was that pretty awesome?
So awesome. So awesome. I mean, this is my first book. Yeah. I sincerely hope that I get to do more. And because I loved it. I loved the book process. Even though it was hard and took a long time, but when I actually got the copies, one of the first things that happened was I told my editor, who had been working with me for so long on this, Hillary Black, because the book got pushed back from the pandemic by 10 months. And, so it just felt like a lot of waiting for it to finally come out. And so when I finally got my copies, I sent a note to my editor, Hillary, and she said, "Have you taken it into a dark room yet?" And I was like, "What?" No. And she said, "Yeah, take one into a dark room and just see." And I was like, "What?" And so I did, and I went in the bathroom, closed the door, and the book glows in the dark.
That's amazing.
It's pretty cool. And like my name glows in the dark and the whole thing. And I had no idea they were doing that. I had no idea that National.
And that's cost, right? That's a commitment to the book to do that, because
I was kind of impressed. I was really kind of touched.
You should be very impressed.
That National Geographic went to the trouble to, do a glow in the dark cover. Right.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Do you ever get asked to consult for any kind of science-based like TV shows? Like if CSI ever does a thing about like anything gross, do they?
That would be, no, I have not done that, but they should call me because
you watch it and you're like, that's just all wrong. I'm sure.
Yeah. And because I'm also trolling the forensic science journals all the time, because that's a big interest of mine. And so I see what's coming out, what new science that's coming out in forensic science. And so, I just have like ideas for things that they should work into their shows based on, real forensic science.
Well, it's interesting because on your website, you also say that you love storytelling. And I think on one of your bios, you talked about how you've actually gone up in comedy clubs and stuff like that before. So that's interesting too, because that is more, I assume you're not going up on stage and talking about science necessarily. So that is more.
Yes. And yeah. I mean, I haven't done, just to be clear, I haven't done tons of this, but it's, I love storytelling, and I got really into, listening to shows like The Moth, and, and This American Life. And I love that kind of stuff. I love that kind of like personal storytelling.
Right.
And I have plenty of like weird and embarrassing stories about myself that for whatever reason, I've been willing to share with people. So there's one podcast called The Story Collider. And before the pandemic, they were doing lots of live shows. And their concept is sort of like The Moth, but with a little bit of a science angle.
Right.
And so the people who are telling the stories are, scientists or science writers or just regular people who have a interesting story that touches on science in their lives. And so I've told a couple of stories through them, and some of those events were held at comedy clubs. And there does tend to be a little bit of science in the stories that the humorous stories that I like to tell. But they're not necessarily stories about science in the same way that, as what I write for Gory Details. But like one story, like probably my best funny and embarrassing story that randomly involves some science is a story. If you Google my name and science of speeding, it'll come up.
Okay.
And it was on Story Collider, and I've told it elsewhere too. And it's the story of how actually when I was moving from Boulder, Colorado to DC, it's the story of how my then boyfriend, now husband, and I were pulled over unknowingly speeding, unknowingly going like 113 miles an hour in my Volkswagen Golf.
Wow.
And we truly had no idea that we were going that fast. And so the science part is all about like how the speedometer was broken in a certain way and where we were with, Eastern Colorado.
Mm-hmm.
We were, far Eastern Colorado, where there's like no trees. There was no nothing. So there was no context whizzing by.
Right.
Very fast.
Right.
It was just kind of like open road. And so we ended up, just having no concept of how fast we were going because the speedometer said we were going 80. And really we were going like 113.
And who would know?
So we got pulled over. It was, it's amazing, but it's kind of a story about like how you can convince yourself of things,
right.
Right. And like how what you see affects what you feel. And then, you can convince yourself of kind of anything when what you're seeing doesn't like match your expectations. Right. So anyway, yeah, it was a whole adventure. My boyfriend got arrested because it was automatic arrest if you're going over 100 miles an hour. And then I had to bail him out, except that I had also lost my wallet that day. And it was just like everything. It was like the day everything possibly went wrong. And then, he ended up in front of a judge who was like, and my husband has a PhD. And the judge is like, you're telling me that you have a PhD in science and that you had no concept that you were going 113 miles an hour. It's like, either you're just a total idiot or you're a liar. My husband's like, no, trust me, I'm just a total idiot.
Like this will make a good story someday, right?
Yeah, exactly. So at least it made for a good story that, it was fun, but it was absolutely the day everything went wrong.
Well, on that note, I think we'll tell a little story.
Yeah.
So you're going to pick a book from the shelves behind me, and we're going to pick a sentence, and I'll read that sentence out, and then you give me the next, whatever, 1, 2, 3 sentences, whatever you feel like doing. And then we'll kind of alternate back and forth just for a few minutes. It can go anywhere. It can go science-y. If it does, it'll probably not be able to contribute very much. Dark, it can go however we want to do it. So give me a number between 1 and 3.
Okay. 1.
Okay. And then 1 through 7.
5.
And then 1 through 20.
14.
So this book, it's funny. I love doing this part because it makes me look at my books again. And I always like, what's the story with that book? Like, why did I buy that book? And I didn't really start reading much, like really getting into reading until my 20s when I was living alone in San Francisco. And I didn't have any money. So I would always buy the biggest books I can find. And so that
they would take you longer to read.
Yeah, it was just more economical. It felt like, so that's, so Stephen King was logic. Like great, like the unabridged version of The Stand, like 1,200 pages. Like great. That's only like used $5. And so I got into John Jakes because his books were big. And I remember thinking it was really the first time I got into a series that I just was captivated by these characters. And, I haven't gone back and read the whole series again, but I just remember loving North and South, which is the book that you picked. So pick a page between 1 and 800.
Oh my God. That's crazy. Yeah. I don't know. Let's say, let's go even 100.
Okay. And then
a sentence between 1 and 5.
3.
All right. I'm going to go to
I'm really nervous what it's going to be.
I'm going to go to page 101 because there actually is no page 100.
Oops. That's okay.
So here we go.
Mm-hmm.
The coat's long, narrow swallowtails carried an extravagant number of stamped gilt buttons, as did each cuff.
You know that coat makes you look ridiculous, she said.
Harold looked over at his wife, slid the coat off, and put it on the edge of the bed. You bought it for me, he said.
But I didn't know you would actually wear it. She said, I mean, if you go out there tonight at this event looking like that, they're going to laugh us out of the room.
Harold started to unbutton his shirt, revealing a ribbon of hardened flesh and scars that he collected over the years. He took it off and pointed to each and every one of them, said to her, it doesn't matter what I wear, as long as it covers up what I'll never let them see, my past.
She traced one of his scars with her finger. It's a past I know all too well, she said. She rebuttoned his shirt and took him by the hand. Let's go make your big announcement, she said.
He squeezed her grip and led her, instead of into the hallway, into his study, where he went to the antique desk and slid open the top left drawer. You forgot about our final step, he said. And she looked down and saw the old letter opener, the one that was way too sharp to only just open letters. He unbuttoned the top button of his shirt, exposing the 2 square inches of skin that were still the same as when he was born. It'll all change tonight, he said.
Oh, God.
I don't know what happens there. I don't know why we started talking about cutters. from John Jakes' North and South. That's just the darkness, I guess, within us. Well, see, it's fun, right? It is. It is so challenging, and it's interesting because that's kind of how I write in like on a bigger picture. Because I don't outline or anything, I start with just kind of an idea for an opening scene, and I have no idea what that scene means or who these people are. It's just like, this is a cool scene that I want to write because it's just weird. And then the rest of the book is like trying to figure out what that scene means. And so this is why I love doing stuff like this, because like it could just go in so many different directions, and it just makes it makes it fun. So
yeah. So do you have so when you start writing a book, do you know what the ending is going to be? No. I
usually know the ending around, 70 to 80% of the way in. It'll usually just hit me. I'm like, oh, or they'll just be like, oh, this is what this book is about. This is the theme of this book that I hadn't realized. I just wanted to write about 2 sisters, and I don't know why, but 3/4 of the way into the book, you realize this is a book about an addiction to saving people or something like that. And you're like, oh, that's interesting. Sometimes I'll have a general idea for an ending, but it's pretty rare. Usually it's just like, no, it causes no end of frustration to my agent and my editor. Cause if you're trying to pitch your next book, I'm like, I know it's about this woman.
It's about this woman. Yeah. Right. I can't imagine getting it. I'm not going to get an agent that way. But that's a very Stephen King kind of approach to writing. I've read his book on writing
it's great
so many times, and I trying to figure out even though I find it's relevant to me in a weird way, even though I'm not writing fiction, but just figuring out how to write in that way where people where reality drops away and you're really only thinking about what you're reading, and you're immersed in it, and you're immersed in that little world. That's like, to me, that's like just kind of an ultimate goal of really entertaining and captivating a reader. And Yeah. So I've read his book several times about writing, and he always says that he doesn't know how a book's going to end when he starts it. And I think a lot of people have also said, yeah, I can tell that from your endings.
Well, you're never going to satisfy even half the people with your endings. But I think that's the kind of thing that you can read about and appreciate, but I think you can't mimic, because people either are outliners or they're not. And I've tried to outline, and I can't do it. My brain doesn't work that way, because once I start writing, all these things come to me in the fluidity of the moment that I never would have thought about just sitting there outlining. There's a happy balance between the two of them, because I can write myself into corners where I'm like, I don't know where I go with this. But the biggest joy of writing to me is when you get lost. Like, I know what the scene is going to be. I'm excited to write the scene. I'm writing the scene, and all of a sudden something comes, and I'm like, holy shit, this is what happens. Or, this person has to die right now. What happened? What would that mean if this person just died right now? And then just that means doing it. It's amazing.
Your brain is so in the story at that point that it's like, I assume that it's a little bit like that, like a movie unfolding before your eyes. Like, all of a sudden you just see the story, and you're part of the story. And then you're just, you're the one who's writing it down.
Yeah, that's true. I write very cinematically. I'm a huge, viewer of movies and TVs and streaming, whatever. And I love it. And so I do write that way a lot. And that's another reason I tend to write from the first person, oftentimes present tense perspective. So you're just like, I go out my door and this is what I see. Like, I want to bring all my empathy to this character and just live my life through them. And then it makes it easier to kind of see through their eyes, and to, and almost to feel like, well, what would I do in this situation? That's what's so fascinating to me. And that's why I try not to delve too much into the unrealistic, because I want to have the stakes really high. I want this to be like, yeah, this could happen. That's just what's personally interesting to me. But because of that, you don't know the end, because you're just walking around with this person. You're like, what happens next? So then you got to balance. Is it interesting? Is it tense? Is it exciting? Does it make sense? And you hope that all is just kind of your subconscious is working and allowing those things. And then obviously there's massive editorial process, and where you get beta readers and other readers and get some insights, and then you start chopping it all up. So
yeah, but I think it's it's interesting. I do see a lot of similarities in just kind of the way your mind has to work when you're writing for fiction and nonfiction, and putting yourself in it. But I totally respect what you do. I mean, it's that to me is, even though I sometimes I wish I weren't bound by the facts, at least they constrain what the story is going to be. And it does, the amount of creativity that you have to make up the whole thing out of whole cloth is amazing to me. I hope that someday I have enough courage to jump in and try it for myself.
Well, it sounds like you have all the goods, and I can tell you, I certainly know I'm not going to jump in and go into nonfiction, because that boat's already sailed. So I think your transition is probably more reasonable.
Listen, I hope so.
Erika, it was really a pleasure to talk to you. I'm fascinated by your story and your journey, and so so happy to see that you have your book that just came out, and it glows in the dark and does all those cool things. I'm sure more will be on the way. So thanks for taking some time to talk.
I appreciate it. Yeah, thank you so much. You've been so fun to talk to, and it's great to talk to writers who do something completely different from what you do.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's
like,
it's all learning.
How are we the same species? I bet we are.
We are. All right. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks again, Erika.
Thanks. Take care.
Bye.
So that was my conversation with Erika. She was great to talk to. I loved her backstory and finding out, how she got into what she's interested in, and certainly love to hear about her passion for writing. If you want to check out her new book, remember the title is Gory Details, an Adventure from the Dark Side of Science. You can get that anywhere where you get your books. If you want to read more about Erika, you can visit her at erikaengelhaupt.com. If you want to know more about me or subscribe to my newsletter, just go to carterwilson.com. In the meantime, more episodes on the way soon. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Take care.